Ibn Khaldun is one of the most important writers of the 1300s, and he writes a whole bunch of things, especially around race. One thing that I've noticed is that a lot of people give up the word Berber to only mean a specific type of people. Giving this up makes it very difficult to argue that the Moors, who to some degree could have been considered a Berber tribe, are of the same or at least have some component of the Berbers. But I will show now that Ibn Khaldun has written down extensively about the Berbers, explaining who exactly they were. In order to do this, we have to look at the map of Africa in North Africa and dot the people that he explains are living in this region. Now, keep in mind, this is the 1300s to the early 1400s that these are written down. Al Masudi, a person who came before him, wrote in 800 AD to the early 900 AD, and his opinions would be very different, but they're not, they're very similar, and we might look at him later. But first, we have to look at Ibn Khaldun in his Al Muqaddimah, a book that tells us a lot about the histories and the formation of different nations around the globe. This is one of those books that mentions Korea, a place that people did not even know existed outside of the Arabs. Though this is the map of Africa, we will completely ignore most of Africa, only focusing in the equatorial and northern regions. For example, if we look at Mauritania and Mali and Niger, we can see that they border the Algiers. And if we look at Niger, Chad, and Sudan and Egypt, we can see they border Libya. And so it is not fair to say that these regions are completely separate from the areas of Africa that are fully in the Sahara, because Sudan, Chad, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, and the Western Sahara are at least partially in the Sahara. In order to understand who is living in these regions, we have to sit down and talk about a couple things. For example, understand that these labels are modern. Most of these regions were not bordered in any way like this in the north because they represented multiple tribes. The Muqaddimah states that there are multiple zones. These zones are not important yet, so I will not mention them. But, he says, the first section of the first zone contains the mouth of the Nile, which has its origin in the mountain of Kumur. As we have mentioned, this Nile is called the Sudanese Nile. It flows towards the surrounding sea and into at the island of Aulil, the city of Silla, Takrur, and Kana are situated along this Nile. At this time, all of them belonged to the Mali people, a Negro nation. Moroccan merchants traveled to their country. Close to it, in the north, is the country of the Lamtuna and of the other groups of the veiled Berbers, the Sinhaja, as well as the deserts in which they roam. To the south of this Nile, there is a Negro people called Lamlam. They are unbelievers. They brand themselves on the face and temples. The people of Ghana and Takrur invade their country, capture them, and sell them to merchants who transport them to the Maghreb. The Sinhaja are a people that, as Ibn Khaldun explains, lie in the middle of the Berbers and the Sudanese. And he also explains the smaller Sinhaja groups, one of them the Godala, situated in Mauritania. Interestingly, Ibn Khaldun says these two statements about Mali All the fruits of the Negro territory come from fortified villages in the desert of the Maghreb, such as Taut, Tigarurin, and Orgala. And then he says, to the east of the territory in the third section of the first zone is the territory of the Gaugau. It lies along a river that has its origin in certain mountains there, flows westward and disappears in the sand in the second section. The realm of the Gaugau was independent. The Mali ruler then gained power over the territory, and it came into his possession. At this time, it is devastated as the result of a disturbance that happened there, and that we shall mention when we discuss the Mali dynasty in its proper place in the history of the Berbers. To the south of the country of Gaugau lies the territory of Kanem, a Negro nation. Beyond them are the Wangara on the border of the Sudanese Nile to the north. To the east of the countries of the Wangara and the Kanem, there is a country of the Zagwe and the Tajira, adjoining the land of the Nuba in the fourth section of the first zone. The land of the Nuba is traversed by the Egyptian Nile throughout its course, from its beginning to the equator to the Mediterranean in the north. We can easily see that he's talking about an entire Sudan region, starting from Libya, going all the way down to the Berber areas of Mauritania. These are all considered Sudan regions until you get to the Nuba regions, which he says obviously are equatorial Nile all the way to the Mediterranean. That's his words. He calls them the Nuba areas. He could have chosen any word. But how do I know that the people that he calls Zagwe and the Tijara are Negroes? Well, besides modern evidence, I can show you here that he writes the second zone. At the southernmost part of the first and second section of the second zone, there is a land of Cumneria. Then to the east there are the southernmost parts of the land of Ghana. Then there are the desert plains of the Zagwe Negroes. In the northernmost part there is the desert of Nisar. It extends uninterruptedly from the west to the east. It has stretches of desert which are crossed by merchants on their way from the Maghreb to the Sudan country. It includes the desert plains of the veiled Sinaja Berbers. Looking at the evidence from where we can tell, the areas that are called the Sudan areas are also populated by Berbers, but they're not called Berber areas, they're called Sudan areas. And so we can easily assume that these Berbers are to Sudan. As they mention, these people, they lie in between the Berbers and the Sudan. And so we can tell that most Berbers would have at least been black. And it makes sense considering the fact that the older versions that we read told us that people who would have been in Algeria, like the Garamantes, were mostly black. So we have things going back thousands of years detailing how black they are, and then we have newer evidence showing that not only did they have access to West Africans, but they lived amongst the West Africans. And we know genetically the West Africans aren't tilted towards Berber tribes, but we know that the Berbers are tilted towards West African tribes. in the areas of Mauritania, Western Sahara, Morocco, and Mali, and all these other places. And it makes sense given how much this place is Sudan. And remember, the Sudan region goes all the way to Libya and the Algiers. It leaves very little space for any other type of person. Those groups would have been a minority. And of course, the Arabs would come in and change that a lot. To cement what he says, he repeats himself and says, it extends uninterruptedly from the west to the east. It has stretches of the desert which are crossed by merchants on their way from the Maghreb to the Sudan country. It includes the desert plains of the veiled Sanhanja Berbers. There are many subgroups comprising the Gadola, the Lamtuna, the Mosafa, the Lamta, and the Watriga. Directly to the east of the waste regions is the land of Fezzan. Then there are the desert plains of the Asgar, a Berber tribe, which extend due east in the southernmost part of the third section. This is followed still in the third section by part of country of Kaur, a Negro nation. Then there is a portion of the land of At Tajuin. The northernmost part of the third section is occupied by the remainder of the land of Wadin, followed directly to the east by the land of Santaria, which is called the Inner Oasis. The Kaur are thought to have been in the northern parts of Lake Chad and in the and the northern parts of Niger, near those mountains. And then the Fezzan regions. Now, what's interesting about the Fezzan regions is that this is the exact place where you would find the Garamantes, as one map shows. Once you know this information, it becomes easy to see how West African cave art depicts some of the same things that you see in North Africa, and all the connections that were in West Africa and North Africa start to fall in place. It's not because that these places were in the Sahara, they were a barrier, but instead they were a gateway to trade, a gateway to live. People from the north move south and people from the south move north. Now, there's also information about how the Sanhaja, the people who were living in the Niger regions, made their way all the way to Spain, according to Ibn Khaldun in the Muqaddimah. While discussing nations that take over faraway nations, this is what he has to say about the Sanhaja from the Sudan. The conditions of the veiled Sanhaja in the Maghreb is another example when they aspired to royal authority. They swarmed out of their desert plains in the neighborhood of the Sudan in the first zone and overran the Spanish realm in the fourth and fifth zone without any intermediate stage. Such is the case with the savage nations. Their dynasties therefore extend over a wide area and over regions farther from the original center than do other nations. We can see from this that these are most likely the Moors that they're talking about. They are of Sudan, they're in Mauritania and other regions that would be Sudanese regions, and they're written about by Ibn Khaldun, saying that they sprung out of the Sudanese regions and went straight to the Spanish regions and colonized it. And remember that the Arabs would too take over the North African regions, changing the genetics of these people, but not as of yet. As you can see, these people are true Sudan. They're in the Sudan regions. Remember, this place is not called Berberland or whatever. It's called the Sudan regions. And that's where they come from. And he says they originate from there. That's important. In conclusion, even if you agree with me or disagree with me, I hope firstly you like, share, subscribe, do whatever you can to support, and make sure that you look exactly up everything I've told you, because there's other people that I'm going to bring up when it concerns the Moors, like that of Al Masudi and all these other people. So